all I thought was the only way to be trans is like you take HRT, you get your surgery, and that is it. But now I knew that there's so many ways to be trans. Trans people, gender queers, trans women, transgenders, hijras, kinnars are centuries old. Okay. So my name's Rayyan Monkey. Rayyan is pronounced like Ray, like sun ka Ray, and Yan like dhaga wala Yan. And my pronouns are she, her, they. And if you get any of them wrong, I'll try and correct you. But eventually, I think I'll get tired and I'll just stop correcting you. I think a way to describe me is that I'm a human being. Because all of the other labels that I can use to describe me end up being limiting. Like I can say I'm a content strategist, but then I do photography and I do other things and I do diversity and inclusion. I think one way I could term it is also I'm a content creator, or trying to be the representation that I didn't have growing up. Yeah. Yeah, you spoke about queer joy and well-being of queer folks, and I think they're very intertwined. I think like right now when we get into like the way that we mostly approach subjects in like when we're trying to change narratives, when we're trying to change culture, when we're trying to influence the way people think, we often try and focus in on pain or the negatives and the downsides. And I think it's also kind of like a majority kind of point of view where we come in and we start to like look at people what they're lacking in life. Like I'll give you an example. Let's like make it very real. Like when you're growing up, how many times have you heard this, right? Like or maybe you didn't, but I heard it, and it's quite common growing up in the countries that we do to hear something like that, like you should be glad you have an entire body, you should be happy that you have two hands, look at them who don't have, and I think that's what happens even with the queer community. We focus in on so much that we don't have as trying to talk about it, that we forget that there is the possibility of having a good life, of being joyful, of being gay, like the original meaning of the more British meaning of the word gay, which is probably I don't know how it got into like this place, but yeah, we so often fixate on all of these other things which are really important. Like I don't want to say that we shouldn't be talking about the abuse we face or the harassment we face or the discrimination or the lack of jobs. We have to, but it's also important to make sure that for young queers, they are able to hear the stories of potential joyful lives, right? And the kind of impact that makes on someone's life is immense. Like I know that for me, one of the contributing factors for me coming to that point where I was able to come out, and I came out at quite a late age. Okay, I started to come out around the age of 29. I started transition around that age, so it's quite a late age. Like, and one of the reasons that happened was because I knew that in Bombay, I could see queer joy happening around me. There were people who were putting up this content and they were living these lives and they were getting some amount of platforming, and beyond that platforming, even on their own blogs, on their own YouTube channels, in their own spheres, they were talking about how things were okay. Like at least, yes, there was struggle every time they go on the road or they're trying to get through the airport or they had to do something with police involved. But they also had friends. They had loved ones, they had parents, some of them, that accepted them. Some of them, like Creativa, for example, is studying to be a doctor as a trans person and transitioning through that process of studying to be a doctor, and look at that, right? And the joy that she has lived. Yeah, of course she has challenges, let's not take away at all. There's Glorious Luna, there's Durga, there's so many people there, and the fact that they're able to put that out there, that they can live these lives, is one of the things that got me to that point. And luckily enough for me, like after I came out, all of these people, the gazy folk, I was able to interact with them. These are like communities that are held in Bombay. They hold spaces, they hold safe spaces. Gays holds quite a lot of space. And like just yesterday, we were at a trans NB mixer here only in Bandra, okay, organized by the gays. And like it is so unreal to think that that's happening right now, right? It's just a bunch of like, not too big, it's very intimate because it's a Wednesday thing, and there's a bunch of us trans NB folk, and we're all just there, like not it's not a dating mixer, it's just like, you know, mixer, like a social, and you like played some games, got to know each other, and shared some joyful stories. Like we set the intention also when we're going to share stories. We set the intention, let's share the joyful stories, because we always sharing those other stories. It's okay, we understand the importance of it. But for us, especially in the community, it's so important to hear the joyful stories. So yeah, that made a huge impact on me. The fact that somewhere in all of that noise and all of these movies that showed, some of them of course just show us in horrible light, like these movies that come out of Indian cinema quite often. But there's also movies that show the harsh realities, right? Like they try and be very realistic. There was a time in the 2000s where realism was quite a thing. So there are quite a lot of these realistic movies, and that was quite frightful, to be honest, as a young queer, you know, closeted queer. And for a lot more queer people out there to think that that's the only life you're going to have, you know, you're going to be abused. And it's real, but there is the chance that you might have a good, happy life, and let's highlight that also. So that's kind of one of the reasons why that is something important to me. I try and focus on it in my work, and I try and I shoot a lot of queer artists and content creators like Durga, like Glorious Luna, and some of the other names that I have taken, and I work with them. And like even with the Queer Muslim Project, like it's such an interesting field. The Queer Muslim Project, the entire thing is about celebrating stories of Muslim queers, but the joyful stories, right? Like we don't do any of the, oh, this one got arrested, or I mean, not we, they, I work with them on and off, they, but they don't do any of these stories like, oh, in Qatar, there were 3 people who were trans who were arrested just before the fucking Qatar World Cup, and that happened for real. But they don't do those stories because that also is a vital space to showcase that joy. Because as a queer Muslim, you don't imagine that to be real, right? Like you don't even think it's going to ever be possible that, oh, wow, there's this queer person living somewhere in the Middle East who's out and, you know, is going on. Yeah, life is hard. They talk about that as well, but they're there. For me, the fact that the Queer Muslim Project existed made so much of a difference, you know, to me being able to imagine, because I was able to stalk these people that Queer Person Project is featuring and go through their content and see, oh my God, she's having some fun there, you know, like, oh my God, that's so cool. Yeah, so you asked about like professional journey, especially as a Muslim person, and added to that as a Muslim trans woman or Muslim queer person. It's very interesting because like, so I'll tell you from like quite a, I'll tell you from like a few different perspectives. So I've actually studied diversity and inclusion. I did a course on it, but it's mainly from the focus point of doing it from the point of view of workplaces. So, and I'm doing some more courses for like other specialities, but this is the one specialty that I did focus in on, which is diversity and inclusion, or queer issues and gender issues at workplace. But let's say, like, let's take it from my example of my life before. So I moved to Bombay in 2013, right? So up until 2013, I was living in Dubai, and I was actually born and brought up there. That doesn't mean that I wasn't aware what it was like being a Muslim, because 9/11 had happened in my childhood, and post 9/11 that Islamophobia had really increased. It started showing up. Like I remember it not being a thing that Bollywood would have Muslims be the terrorists on screen, and then it going to being a thing. So I was definitely internalizing that stuff, even though I was living in Dubai. But when I started my professional career, the fact that I was a Muslim never came in the way, because it's a Muslim country, right? So it never really came in the way. But I only did like about 2 years in Dubai before I moved to Bombay, and then I continued working here. So right off the bat, like just something I don't want to deep dive into, but just a little bit to give you context. Right off the bat, when I came to Bombay and I started applying in advertising agencies, I was coming in from one of the biggest advertising agencies, Ogilvy, and I started applying to all the agencies here, even the ones who were putting out for someone, including Ogilvy itself. But you know, I'm applying to all of them, and I wasn't getting any callbacks. I'm not getting any interview requests and etc. And at that time, no part of me thought that this has anything to do with the fact that I have a Muslim name, and that's at the head of my CV. And this time I'm mass presenting. This is before my transition and things. But eventually I did get a job through connections, because I knew someone's sister. like the founder's sister, and that's how I actually got the job, honestly speaking, through like connections and privilege. But otherwise I was not getting any, right? And later on when I got that job, at some point someone had done this one of these studies in India, where one of these kind of social experiments where they had sent out and documented it all, sent out a whole bunch of CVs with different sounding names but the same content, and they got varying results. And it's right there, like when you have something that's a very obviously Muslim sounding name, very obviously Dalit sounding name, they had the same results. Like even there was a change in gender and the kind of results you were getting, even though the qualifications were the same, right? Like literally the CV is the same. The only thing that was different was the name, the genders, upper caste, lower caste, religions, etc. And the proof was there, like in these studies the proof is there that there is that kind of a thing. But when I started transitioning, what happened is, one, though, I started losing some work because I'm trans, and because of the kind of work I do, quite a lot of time I'm shooting content or I'm directing a team. I'm very much on the ground, maybe at the event, maybe at the promotional event, or involved with meetings and things like that. So very silently some of these clients started to move away, who felt like they couldn't facilitate that happening, right? But there were some clients that even stood completely and didn't have any issues. And like, for example, I'd take it with name Taj Hotel Starter. They're quite interesting. Like I was working at Taj Hotel before my transition, continue to work with them. After transition, the relationship has not solved. Also, they have trans women in their corporate sector hired, especially in the diversity and inclusion. So there are corporates who are doing these kind of things, But at the same time, to give you more context to this issue, is just taken on the level of queer. Okay, there's a study that was done by Ipsos. It's either EPSOS or IPSOS, so you can cite it. And they did a bunch of studies around this workplace thing. So one of the things is India has the highest identifying queer population in terms of, like, not highest, but like one of the higher sides, right? Like in terms of total population, quite a lot of, like, we're not entirely straight. Yet India had one of the lowest numbers saying that we know someone who's queer. And this has a lot to do with workplace, because workplace affects food, your survival, right? So you're not going to mess with that. If being queer, if being out is going to mess with your survival, right, you're not going to mess with that. So you would rather just hide it, right? Just be closeted. And that's what ends up happening in India quite a lot. So there was, again, in that survey, but I've by now forgotten the numbers, but there was a good amount of people who said that because they were out at work, they got bullied or jokes or something. Some straight up abused, some straight up fired when they came out, right? Abuse happens a lot because people tend to think it happens like the same, like with any kind of minority. People think that this power dynamic that happens and they can get away with abusing anyone in minority positions. So that kind of stuff happens. And therefore we have this huge kind of gap in the employment rates, right? Like there is a concentrated and real effort, like I'm not going to deny it, and we have to recognize it so that people realize it's happening. Even Godrej does a bunch of it. Godrej also has a trans person on their team, and they have a whole program where, I'm not sure what it is, but they're specifically hiring trans people, right? Kaya did something last year. It is changing, but it's changing after these studies which stand true to these things, right? So the experience for me, on one more example, I want to give you context about being Muslim, is one of the things, like I said in the earlier thing that I spoke to you about, is I'm trying to be the representation I never had, right? Like growing up, I grew up in Dubai, quite conservative environment. I grew up in a Muslim family, so not very conservative. And then I grew up in India also, like, I grew up with that kind of stigma and everything attached. Like, it's only been now that we got 377 abolished. Like we got it, it's been recent, same with the Trans Act coming in place. So I grew up in all of these times, and I think, like, I knew one of the major things that held me back was a lack of representation. There was no Muslim trans woman I could relate to. There is today. There's Kushi, there's Dr. Sahiba, both are doing their things in India. Different spaces, we all are quite different spaces, but they are there. And that's what helped. Finally finding that content, finding representation, right? And that's the kind of work I want to do, for which it really, really requires me to have somewhat of a platform. That's kind of required, because if you want people out there to know that you're queer and you're Muslim and that people are living these lives, and the kind of content where we're creating, and we're talking about our history, where queer, but it has always been around in the culture of the people, lived experiences, right? So especially in this climate that we are there today, globally and nationally, in India, it becomes really hard to find platforms that will give you a voice because you're Muslim. So a lot of brands do not want to do that. A lot of brands, a lot of organizations do not want to talk about religion. And this has been a thing like that it's come up in pride marches and stuff. Like in the past, there was this whole thing that happened in the Bombay Pride March. I don't know if you know about the story. I only know of it like historically because I came out. I'm a young queer. I just came out. But basically, there was some scenes that they didn't want to talk about political things and they didn't want to bring up religious issues in the Pride March. And that has been a traditional part of like the Indian LGBTQI movement. And the thing is, there's no way for me to like not have religion in the conversation because my entire purpose is about speaking to a particular intersectionality that happens that gets very heavily overlooked, and the kind of damage it causes is intense, from mental health to everything to do with mental health to everything else that happens. And we know the numbers and like the disproportionate suicide rates, the disproportionate mental health issues, the disproportionate addiction resulting from the depression, these kind of issues that happens in these populations that are not allowed to find community and actualize. But this is what we need. Like this is what folks like me have to do so that we can get a stamp that says, hey, you're good to go, we can work with you. So I actually knew about HRT when I was a child. Actually, that's like it's a good place to start. So it's been a journey. So it was around the age of like maybe 10, 12 or 14 when I came across this article. I speak about this article a lot. But this article was basically when I was in Dubai. It was an article about 6 Iranian trans women who had medically transitioned. So they had chosen, not chosen, but they had the social dynamics is different there. Let's not get into it. It's a very different situation, but not a lot of people know about this. Since 1976, Iran has had sex reassignment surgery completely legal in Iran, but for various reasons. So we won't go into it. But that's the article I read, and so I knew I knew about this process, I knew about HRT, but that article at that age, with my reality, with my lack of awareness, with my lack of understanding of what it actually means to be trans, various ways of being trans, it was quite a lot for me to take in, especially living in the family that I was living in the country where I was living in the kind of culture that I belong to as an Indian person. And all of those things kind of made me shut that thing down. So I kind of like just blocked it off. And then when I was coming around to 2020, when the lockdown was happening, is when I was watching the documentary Disclosure, which is a brilliant documentary, and I can talk hours about it. But this documentary basically deep dives into how trans representation happened and what that does for trans people. Forget everyone else, but what that does for trans people growing up who are watching that stuff. And so for me, at that time when that happened, it kind of, when I watched that documentary, it brought this memory back. And then this was again on my mind. And then I found Dr. Trinetra online, and she had done this thing very realistically where she had put out the prices of the cost of the various things. Now, today her cost might be outdated because she had put it out quite some time ago, but she must have updated it. But that time was very relevant for me 2 years ago. And it was very groundbreaking. Like the fact that someone has put out that, yeah, you can get from pharmacy, you have to get a prescription first, you have to do this first, and these are the steps, and this is how much it's going to cost you. And then you can get on with like medical transition. It was very real to me, right? And that made it very like feasible. And it was a big part of it. After that, luckily also what happened is because in the meanwhile I had consumed so much info from that time I read that magazine article to my actual realization, acceptance, and coming out and beginning to work, like the journey. I had consumed so much more information that I knew that being trans now I knew that being trans isn't just what I read in that magazine article. When I read it that time, all I thought was the only way to be trans is like you take HRT, you get your surgery, and that is it. But now I knew that there's so many ways to be trans, right? There's HRT, which is hormone replacement therapy, and we are not the only people who do it. A lot of cisgender women do it, a lot of cisgender men do it for various reasons. Sometimes men do it for reasons as shallow as hair loss. But so cisgender women do it for various reasons, including menopause or having period issues. So it's hormone replacement therapy, and that's one thing I started learning about. But I also at that point luckily was able to see that this is an option. It is not the only way to be trans, and there's other ways to be trans. So I actually do not know whether I will have a surgery. I do not like think about it too much. I just kind of try and live in my journey. And along the way, I kind of also realized this kind of fixation with this whole HRT and having a surgery, and that everybody should do a surgery, and asking every trans person, are you going to do a surgery? And it's such a fixation, right? And it's really like tells a lot about society, about how they see us and how they see how binary the worldview is, that is the thing that drives them the most. But the reality is that this whole medical and HRT and sex reassignment surgery is like 100 and 200 years old. But trans people, genderqueers, trans women, transgenders, hijras, kinnars are centuries old, okay, and have always existed. Even when the Christopher Columbus landed on that side, there were trans people there. There were two-spirit people even in North America, right? They weren't ever. Some places there was medical intervention. For example, like something like a eunuch situations, those kind of medical interventions there is even some talk about where herbs were used, because these herbs also regulate the flow of hormones. But for the most part, it was non-medically assisted, what we would call today transition. So, it's really like, I would say, whenever we're talking about trans issues, this is a huge part of our journey, and it is something that we need help from, we need support from government for, but it's not something that we should get so caught up in, because there's a lot of different ways of being trans, right? And like, I do take HRT, and it's been something that's very gender affirming for me, but there's different ways of being trans, and like, I don't identify with all the ways that everybody chooses to be, because everyone's experience is different. This is like it's a minefield. Like, it's been like quite the there's this thing, right? Like, yeah, it's been quite a mess. I would say it's so messy. I'm at this place where I'm really trying to like get out of my head about when I'm like present day trying to find intimacy and trying to find love and even sexual exploration and sexual intimacy. I'm trying to get out of my head, because I'm so in my head about it these days. And I'll tell you why. Like, there's this thing that we always say, like these trans LGBTQI activists, queer activists, pride movements, they'll always say this thing: gender and sexuality are not the same, and stop confusing them. Okay, gender is different and sexuality is different, sexual orientation is different and gender is different. And we always keep messing them up and confusing them. And really, they are different, right? They are genuinely different, and we need to stop looking at them as being the same. But that's what we do most of the time. We really spend so much time confusing the two that for me, I have like everything is a struggle around these things, because I internalized that so much that legit, right? Like when I first had that memory that we spoke about, Disclosure documentary, when that documentary, I watched the documentary and this memory came back from my childhood, and I'm like, now what do? I had this memory. Yes, I was very sad at that time. I did want to take this journey, and I wanted to identify that way the journey, but then I didn't ever get around to doing it. But now what do? I've already lived so much of my life, etc., etc. And at this point, when I start to get on with this journey, and I'm thinking like, should I do something? Should I just let it be? Should I just ignore it? Like, already 29 years have happened. The voice that kept coming in my own head, the sentence that kept coming back in my own head is, how can you be trans? You to love women. You've had so many girlfriends. At that point, I've been in a lot of relationships. Let's not give a number to it. It just makes me look bad. But like, embrace the sluts. But like, but yeah, it makes me look slutty. And but there's a lot of context, people. There's a lot of context to the number of people I've dated, because I have like other issues going on. But I have dated a lot of people, and that was a sentence that kept coming up in my head, because I'm like, in my head, in my body, I'm like, right now I feel like I want to be a woman. That's what I want to be. I want to identify as a woman. I want to use she, her pronouns. That's what feels right. But you are in a relationship with a cisgender woman. Like, that was actually my position. Was at the time when that memory happened, there was this girl who was really close to me, and then we eventually started dating. And even when we started dating, she knew that this is something I'm dealing with, and I might not be identifying as a man anymore. It's all confusing, and we still got into a relationship, and we're in love, right? And I love this woman, and I'm like, oh, but can you be trans because you love women? And I've had like same-sex encounters in my life, even early on in my life and all, but Exactly. I've had same-sex encounters even early on in my life, yet my head is like, you can't be trans because how can you be trans? You love women. And the entire time my mind is doing that, I'm completely invalidating the experience of any lesbian woman. Think about it. That's what lesbian women do. They are women who get intimate with other women. They love other women. And I'm like, no, but how can I be a trans woman? Because I like women. And today I'm pansexual and I hook up with men from Grindr and I date women as well, and it's all very complicated and I'm always in my head about it because of all of this stuff that's in my head. Like sentence that kept coming up is an indication of what is in my head, and in my head gender and sexuality are so mixed up because the world kept mixing it up that it is so mixed up. I'll tell you one of the most liberating things that was happening in these early days of the transition phase was while I was in this relationship with this cisgender woman, we introduced a sex toy into the relationship. So we got like a dildo, and I got to explore things with that dildo. And I think because my mind is the way it is, where gender and sexuality is all messed up and mixed up and confusing, that actually was a very affirming experience for me. The fact that I was experiencing sex in that way, even if it was coming from a cisgender woman, and I was enjoying it, I was feeling loved, I was feeling intimate, there was emotions being exchanged, was really liberating, right? Because my mind is so gender sexuality. So it was really liberating to have that. And even today, actually, I have a drawer. So I have a drawer in my room. It's a foot drawer. And sometimes my cat gets into it. It's hilarious when they do. Because as soon as I started, like I said, there was that toy. But as soon as I came out and I started creating content and doing things like that, I started getting into these safe spaces and these different brands and things like that. And there were other brands that would be around and sex toys. So I started getting a good collection. So I have a pretty good collection now going on in this drawer that sometimes my cat gets into, and it's quite hilarious because then he pulls out this, there's a blindfold and he pulls out a blindfold and then it's a mess. But that drawer is currently my it's a really gender affirming space for me because I have sexual experiences with myself. Sometimes I introduce it into intimate experiences with other people, and if I trust them, but it's really about, I think for me, more they give me more power, they give me more liberation, they give me more of understanding of myself when I use them myself in my own space. And yeah, that's why I really like that. Yeah, so that's what it's been like, trying to find intimacy these days. So I'll be honest, I have a very toxic relationship with social media. And it's a very complicated relationship. So I think it actually started before social media existed because I got a camera in my hand, some friend's camera, not my own, when I was around 14, 15 years old. Like whenever we were at a party, the parent would give the cam and I would be able to shoot through this digital cam. And I started taking these pictures, and at that time I didn't have anywhere to put them, and then social media came and I used to document everything. And because I was a closeted person going through my own journey, I like to hide behind the camera. I like to click other things that were going on because they were a lot more magical for me than I was. And this kind of became this thing that became a habit. So now social media came around, I got into social media, I started doing this every party I would go to. As soon as Facebook came, I was that person that every party would go to, I would have an album. Now I'm the person who every event I go to, there's a reel, right? Like after every event I go to, there's a reel. And there is this element over there, to be very honest, of did I even live it if I didn't put it out? Okay. There's also this other element happening there because I started at a very early age of shooting content so much. I have this obsession or this idea in my head that if I don't click it, if I don't click it, I'll forget, right? And also because I've clicked so much, now I'll have to keep clicking because otherwise how will I remember anything? And so it then became that, but I don't really go back and look at these pictures either. And then social media came along and I really got into it. I started working. So my entire career I've worked in social media. So social media for me is work, right? But it's also a lot more now, but I will get to that. But then from the time my career started, it's been digital marketing, it's been content. So I've been doing it for brands, I've been doing it for clients. That's also the reason why I got to this point where around the time when I was transitioning, I was so adept with it. I was so at home being online, using this medium to find people, to find communities, but to also create content and put out content, and easy to tell stories, to edit videos, to take photos that work for this medium. All of that was really easy to me at this point. The one thing that I knew from other people's experiences that social media provides that I had not yet experienced myself, because another thing about me is that in 2016, the company I work at, Fat Smiggle, we started to get into influencer management, which is like when influencers still like, the word was not coming out. We were still using bloggers. Influencers came out probably later that year and we still call them bloggers. But around that time, so we really saw this, how to create this content, and we saw how for some people that could be really like almost like therapy, being able to find your affirmations there, being able to find your little bubble there, right? And I saw this happen even for other trans women, right? Like, because so many of the content creators that we spoke about were people that I was following, and I was seeing their journey, and I was seeing them say how much they were able to find. But all of this time, what had become a default for me, it wasn't an effort, it had just become a default for me, was to share everything on social media, right? So by the time that I got to this point where I started to come out, like I remember that year 2021 when I was coming out, I actually shaved, so I used to have a beard, so I actually shaved in March or August, not March, I shaved in August and I came out in October. So I shaved my face in August and I came out in October, and for a whole bunch of months, nobody knew other than the people in my daily life that I had shaved. I went to Goa that year, and I went to Goa for like a work trip, and I not come out to my family, so I went to Goa for like almost a week, and I came back, I went by flight as femme, present in femme wearing dress, but no pictures of me on my social media. And all of that was torture for me. It just felt unreal, because by this point, not putting up something on social media felt like lying. Okay, so weird, but that's my relationship with social media. So I was like really distraught about the fact that because I was not come out to my family, I can't be putting out my pictures and stuff. At that point, I had done this dance when I still had this beard. I wore a ghagra and I did a dance somewhere in a forest around a few people with a performance, and I put that video up online, and my family had issues with that. And I was like with my beard, mass presenting, only thing I'd worn a black ghagra. So when I did come around and I did come out to them, and I told them I'm going to come out on social media, they were like, no, why don't you like just not come out on social media, or why don't you go private? And I'm like, at this point in my life, if I did that, it would feel like lying. And I've come so late into this point where I'm transitioning, I can't lie. And this other thing that I knew and that started happening at that point was, once I came out, I put out this coming out post. I did that mostly with the purpose of announcing it and getting a lot of people to know. But as soon as I did that in the first post, all of these affirmations came back and the support came back, and I'm like, I need that stuff, because my family by then had stopped talking to me. So this affirmation, this family ka, yeah, you're doing good, you go ahead, you're doing fine, that had stopped. There were people in my life, quite magical, amazing people that are still there and supported me, like the person I told you earlier who was in love with me and I loved them back. But that family had stopped, and in the meanwhile, as soon as I came out, this social media had started. I knew that I wanted to get some content out there because I wanted to tell some stories about the Muslim history around the queer culture and how it can happen, and intersections and etc. So I knew I wanted to do that, and this started happening where people started to be there for me, started to be, I started to find a community, slowly started to build, and people really like would write things that were very powerful and say things like, it's so hard for me to say it because I have this whole like forced humility shit, okay, but like let's push it aside, but say things like, you're very beautiful, we really love what you're doing, it means a lot to us that you're doing these things. And that became, of course, an addiction. And now, very honestly, that's my relationship with social media, where it is also, of course, a route for me to try and find a platform and get that story out. It's also a means to work with other organizations like the Queer Muslim Project, Gazy, Gay Gays, etc. But it's also right now the only place where I'm most honest. It is so weird. It is so weird. And this is the thing that you will see with other queer people happen on social media. And it's because you find this affirmation, you find this community. It's weird how much more honest you are on social media than you are away from the screen. And that's kind of my reality. Like, I'll literally go to an event and shit will happen and I'll be in my head about it and I'll feel awkward, and then I'll go and write a long caption explaining why the fuck I behave that way. But it'll happen on social media. Like, I'm okay with like calling myself out on everything on social media and like retrospectively doing it, but not like when I'm around people. And people, like, sometimes I like, people know this about me, even people who I work with and some friends and stuff from the community. They're like, yeah, Rayyan can express her emotions better through her content than in words. Like, I'll make a reel and it'll tell you I love you, but
Like what you saw? Support us so we can create more empowering content for you. Like and share this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel.